At approximately 14:30 hours on a summer afternoon in July 1943, a guarded passenger train crossed into the flat farmland of central Kansas, moving west at roughly 40 miles per hour. Inside one of its cars sat 287 German prisoners of war, recently transported from the eastern seaboard of the United States. The train had departed Camp Shanks in New York days earlier and was bound for Camp Concordia, Kansas, where the prisoners would spend the remainder of the war. The men were seated on wooden benches behind barred windows, guarded, but otherwise unrestrained. Their capture had occurred months earlier in North Africa and Tunisia, at the end of a campaign they had been told would never be lost. What they were about to witness should not have been possible. Nazi doctrine regarding the United States was explicit and consistent. Germany's leadership had spent years presenting America as an unstable, collapsing society. According to official propaganda, the American economy had never recovered from the Great Depression. Rural regions were described as impoverished. Farmers were said to live at subsistence level, exploited by financial elites, lacking modern infrastructure and dependent on government relief. Industrial output was portrayed as artificial and temporary, driven by debt rather than real capacity. The prisoners on the train believed this. They had grown up under that narrative. It had been reinforced through schools, radio broadcasts, newspapers, and military briefings. Many of them had never traveled outside Germany before the war. Their understanding of America was theoretical, shaped entirely by state messaging. As the train rolled westward through Kansas, that understanding began to collapse. Outside the barred windows, farmland stretched toward distant horizons. Wheat fields rolled past in long, uninterrupted bands of green and gold. But it was not the land itself that held the prisoners' attention. It was what stood beside it. Farmhouses appeared at regular intervals. In front of nearly everyone stood automobiles, not military vehicles, not government transports, personal cars, sedans, pickup trucks, delivery vehicles. Some were parked beside barns. Others sat in driveways. A few waited at rural crossroads as the train thundered past. Dust coated their fenders. Tools and personal belongings were visible through windows. These were vehicles in daily use. One prisoner, a 23-year-old corporal from the outskirts of Hamburg, pressed his face against the bars and began counting. 3 farms in 10 minutes, each with its own automobile. His older companion dismissed it at first, suggesting they must belong to officials or cooperatives. But the evidence did not support that explanation. The cars bore no markings. The wear patterns were domestic, not institutional. Electricity followed. Power lines marched across the countryside in long straight runs, connecting farmhouses and outbuildings alike. Wooden poles carried wires into areas that, by German standards, should not have been electrified at all. In Germany, even in 1943, many rural villages relied on kerosene lamps. Electrical service was incomplete outside major population centers. Here, it appeared universal. The train passed small towns. Water towers painted with town names rose above clusters of buildings. Main streets were lined with shops. At crossings, cars queued patiently, waiting for the train to pass. Children waved. Some prisoners waved back before realizing what they were doing. none of this aligned with what the prisoners had been taught. According to German economic assessments, America should have been suffering visible deprivation. Instead, what the prisoners saw suggested widespread material abundance. Modest farmhouses possessed infrastructure that, in Germany, marked someone as wealthy. Refrigerators were visible through windows. Radios played inside homes. Ordinary civilians dressed cleanly and moved freely. This contradicted not just propaganda, but wartime logic. Germany in 1943 was a nation under strain. Rationing was severe. Private automobile use had effectively ceased. Fuel was reserved for military operations. Consumer goods were scarce. Even officers' families faced shortages. The idea that enemy civilians, especially farmers, lived better than German soldiers was not merely incorrect. It was ideologically unacceptable. Yet the evidence outside the train windows was unambiguous. The prisoners did not see signs of emergency mobilization or collapse. They saw a society functioning normally while fighting a global war. The farms were not estates, they were working properties. The towns were not showpieces. They were ordinary communities that the speed of the train prevented prolonged examination. But repetition replaced detail. Farm after farm, town after town. The pattern held. A photograph taken by an Army Signal Corps photographer later that year shows prisoners inside such a train car, their faces turned toward barred windows, expressions difficult to read. The official caption records only the movement of German prisoners to Camp Concordia in July 1943. It does not record what they were seeing. For the men inside the train, the realization formed slowly but decisively. The United States was not weak. Its rural population was not impoverished. Its economy had not collapsed. What the prisoners were witnessing should not have existed. According to everything they had been taught, and once seen, it could not be unseen, according to German economic doctrine and wartime intelligence briefings. What the prisoners were observing could not be real. The assessments issued to Wehrmacht units before deployment described the United States as a nation with impressive industrial potential, but deep internal weakness. American production, they were told, depended on fragile financial systems and artificial credit. Rural regions were portrayed as backward, lacking infrastructure, and heavily dependent on government assistance. The image was consistent. America could build machines, but it could not sustain a modern society at scale. This belief was reinforced deliberately. German planners had studied the American economy through pre-war data, much of it drawn from the early 1930s. The Great Depression loomed large in these analyses. Unemployment figures, bank failures, and farm foreclosures were cited repeatedly. Later recovery was dismissed as superficial. Rearmament-driven growth was described as temporary, driven by debt rather than capacity. The conclusion was clear. America might fight briefly, but it would not endure. That conclusion shaped strategy. It justified underestimating American staying power. It supported the belief that morale would collapse once losses mounted. It assumed that the American population, especially outside cities, lacked the material base to support a prolonged global war. German prisoners carried these assumptions with them. They had been trained to see enemy prosperity as illusion, showpieces, isolated examples designed for propaganda. not as indicators of general conditions. They expected any signs of abundance to be limited, staged, or confined to elites. What they saw in Kansas did not fit that framework. The farmland outside the train was not exceptional. It was repetitive. The same features appeared mile after mile. Automobiles were not rare. They were common. Electric lines did not serve a few houses. They served all of them. Roads were paved or well maintained. Farm equipment visible in fields was modern and plentiful. From an engineering standpoint, this mattered. Mechanized agriculture required fuel, spare parts, skilled labor, and capital investment. Tractors, combines, and trucks were not symbols. They were systems. Their presence indicated supply chains functioning at depth. It indicated surplus beyond subsistence. German doctrine assumed that wartime economies sacrificed civilian comfort to sustain military output. Germany had done exactly that. Civilian fuel use was restricted. Consumer goods production was curtailed. Transportation prioritized the front. Rural areas felt shortages acutely. America appeared not to be doing this. The prisoners did not see fuel scarcity. They saw cars in daily use. They did not see blackout measures. They saw open homes and lit buildings. They did not see ration queues. They saw commerce proceeding normally. This contradicted the German model of total war. In German planning, total war required total sacrifice. Civilian consumption declined sharply as military demand rose. That trade-off was assumed to be universal. A nation that did not visibly sacrifice was assumed to be uncommitted or incapable. America's ability to avoid that trade-off challenged the underlying model. From a logistical perspective, what the prisoners saw implied extraordinary capacity. For rural electrification to be widespread, generation and distribution networks had to exist far beyond urban centers. For automobiles to remain common during wartime, fuel production had to exceed both civilian and military demand. For farms to remain mechanized, manufacturing had to supply both domestic and export needs simultaneously. German intelligence had not accounted for this. Pre-war assessments underestimated American oil production. They underestimated the scale of American electrical generation. They underestimated agricultural efficiency driven by mechanization and scale. They also underestimated geographic insulation. The continental United States had not been bombed. Its infrastructure had not been disrupted. Production occurred without interruption. The prisoners did not think in these analytical terms, but they sensed the implications. If farmers owned cars, factories could build them. If power lines reached isolated homesteads, electricity was abundant. If towns functioned normally, labor and transport were stable. This suggested reserves beyond anything Germany possessed. The impossibility was psychological as well as material. German soldiers had been taught that hardship proved commitment, that suffering signaled strength. Here, the enemy appeared strong without visible suffering. That inversion undermined years of ideological conditioning. Some prisoners attempted to rationalize what they saw. They suggested that the route was chosen deliberately to mislead them, that the farms were model settlements, that the cars belonged to officials, that electricity was temporary. These explanations failed as the hours passed. The pattern did not change. Train schedules were not propaganda tools. They followed rail efficiency, not staging. The evidence accumulated. What the prisoners were witnessing was not a facade. It was ordinary life. From the standpoint of German doctrine, this should not have been possible. A nation fighting on multiple fronts, supplying allies across oceans, and preparing for invasion of Europe should have shown signs of strain. Germany did. Britain did. Even neutral countries did. America, at least in this view from a train car, did not. This realization did not require explicit discussion. It formed quietly. Men fell silent. Conversations stopped. Eyes remained fixed on the passing landscape. The impossibility was no longer abstract, it was visible, continuous, and undeniable, and it raised a question no one voiced aloud. If this was what American civilian life looked like in the middle of the war, what reserves remained unseen. The men inside the train were not ideologues or economists. They were ordinary soldiers. Most were in their early 20s. A few were older non-commissioned officers. They had been conscripts, not planners. Before the war, they had worked as mechanics, clerks, farmhands, factory laborers, apprentices. Their understanding of the world came from daily life, not abstract theory. They had lived through the 1930s in Germany. They remembered unemployment lines. They remembered hunger winters. They remembered farms failing and cities struggling. They remembered how the regime had promised recovery through discipline, sacrifice, and rearmament. For many of them, the military had offered stability when civilian life had not. That experience shaped their assumptions. When they entered the army, they were told that Germany's recovery was unique, that other nations had failed where Germany had succeeded, that capitalism had collapsed elsewhere, that America's wealth was exaggerated and fragile. These ideas were not questioned because they aligned with lived experience. Germany had improved materially in the late 1930s. Roads were built. Employment rose. Military production surged. To the men who later boarded the train in Kansas, this progress felt real. It reinforced belief in the system that produced it. Their capture in North Africa had already shaken some of those beliefs. The campaign had not unfolded as promised. Supplies were inadequate. Air superiority was lost. Allied forces appeared better equipped and better supported. Even so, many prisoners attributed defeat to local mistakes rather than systemic weakness. The journey across the Atlantic introduced further strain. They saw American ports functioning at scale. Ships moved constantly. Cargo was handled efficiently. There were no visible shortages. The food they were given during transport was plentiful and varied. This contrasted sharply with rations at home, which had already been reduced. Still, these observations could be dismissed. Ports were strategic assets. They might be prioritized. Food for prisoners might be exceptional. None of it proved general conditions. The Kansas countryside did. The prisoners' backgrounds made what they saw difficult to reconcile. Many came from rural Germany. They understood farming. They knew what it took to maintain equipment, repair tools, and secure fuel. They knew how difficult it was to keep a single tractor operating under wartime restrictions. What they saw outside the train windows exceeded that. Farms were not just mechanized. They were fully mechanized. Equipment was not old or improvised. It was modern and plentiful. Barns were well maintained. Fields were orderly and productive. There was no visible labor shortage. This contradicted German experience directly. In Germany, young men had been drafted en masse. Farms relied increasingly on women, elderly men, and foreign laborers. Equipment wore out. Fuel shortages forced reversion to animal power in some areas. Harvests suffered. The prisoners knew this firsthand. Seeing American farms operate smoothly while fighting the same war challenged assumptions rooted in daily reality. Not propaganda alone. Age mattered. These were men young enough to adapt, but old enough to compare. They were not children. They had seen hardship. They understood scarcity. They could recognize abundance when it appeared. Their reactions were not dramatic. There were no outbursts, no declarations. The realization unfolded quietly. Some men stopped speaking entirely. Others asked questions in low voices. A few stared without expression, absorbing what they saw without comment. This was not admiration. It was recalibrat. I own. Their understanding of the enemy shifted from caricature to capacity, from weakness to endurance, from temporary threat to long-term opponent. No one on the train articulated this in ideological terms. There was no collective conclusion, but the underlying assumption changed. America was not fighting on borrowed time. For these prisoners, that realization mattered more than any speech or briefing. It came not from argument, but from observation. Not from theory, but from repetition. Farm after farm. Town after town. Car after car. The evidence accumulated faster than doubt could keep pace. By the time the train neared its destination, the question was no longer whether the American economy could sustain the war. It was whether Germany's ever could. As the train continued westward, the observations became more specific. The prisoners were no longer reacting only to general impressions. They began to notice details that required closer attention. Grain elevators rose beside the tracks at regular intervals, each connected to spur lines branching off the main rail. Cars stood waiting to be loaded. Others were already full, sealed, and ready for departure. The flow was continuous, not hurried, and not interrupted by military traffic. This mattered. Rail transport in Germany had become increasingly congested. By 1943, civilian traffic was routinely delayed or canceled to prioritize military movement. Freight yards were crowded. Equipment shortages were common. Rail lines were strained by bombing and overuse. Here, rail traffic appeared unconstrained. The prisoners watched as passenger trains passed in the opposite direction, filled with civilians. Freight trains followed, carrying agricultural goods, machinery, and fuel. None showed signs of emergency operation. Schedules appeared stable. Infrastructure was intact. The train slowed briefly at a junction. As it did, the prisoners could see into the nearby town. Shops were open. Delivery trucks stood at loading bays. Civilians moved about without visible restriction. There were no guards, no ration checkpoints, no blackout shutters. The war was not absent, but it was not dominant. This contrasted sharply with conditions at home. In Germany, by 1943, civilian life revolved around regulation. Travel required documentation. Goods were rationed. Shops operated under scarcity. Public spaces reflected constraint. Even small towns showed signs of mobilization. The Kansas towns did not dot as the train resumed speed. Conversation resumed quietly among the prisoners. They compared what they were seeing with what they knew. Some mentioned their families' farms. Others recalled shortages. A few spoke of letters received from home describing increasing hardship. These were not ideological exchanges. They were practical comparisons. The train passed fields where crops were being harvested. Mechanical harvesters moved in coordinated patterns. Trucks followed, collecting grain. Labor appeared organized and efficient. There was no visible shortage of fuel or machinery. The scale was larger than most prisoners had known in Europe. Agricultural output at this level implied more than food security. It implied surplus. Surplus meant exports. Exports meant logistics. Logistics meant industrial depth. Industrial depth meant resilience. These conclusions did not require formal analysis. They followed naturally from what was visible. The prisoners did not need to see factories to understand this. Farms were enough. At several points, the train passed military installations. They were modest in appearance. Barracks, training grounds, airstrips. None were heavily fortified. None were concealed. Their presence suggested confidence rather than vulnerability. These facilities coexisted with civilian infrastructure rather than dominating it. This observation reinforced earlier impressions. In Germany, military presence had become pervasive. Bases expanded into towns. Training grounds displaced farms. Civilian life adapted to military necessity. Here, the balance appeared reversed. The prisoners noted the absence of destruction. There were no bombed buildings, no damaged bridges, no repaired rail sections, no visible signs of air attack. The war had not reached this land physically. That fact alone altered calculations. A nation fighting without domestic disruption retained advantages that could not be compensated for through strategy alone. As the afternoon wore on, fatigue set in. The prisoners had been traveling for days. Hunger and uncertainty dulled reactions. Yet the visual evidence continued uninterrupted. The pattern did not weaken with distance. By the time the train approached Camp Concordia, the realization had settled. This was not a prepared corridor. It was not a showcase. It was normal. The camp itself came into view without ceremony. Guard towers stood at intervals. Barracks were arranged neatly. Fences enclosed the perimeter. The facility was functional rather than imposing. Guards appeared, alert but unhurried. Procedures were orderly. As the prisoners disembarked, they were processed efficiently. Names were recorded, personal effects inventoried. Instructions were given calmly. There was no shouting, no urgency. The routine suggested confidence and control. From a military standpoint, this was significant. A system that operates calmly under strain indicates surplus capacity. The guards were not stretched. The infrastructure was sufficient. The camp did not rely on improvisation. For the prisoners, this final stage reinforced what they had seen and wrote. The United States was not mobilizing at the edge of collapse. It was operating from depth. Its civilian economy, agricultural base, and logistical networks functioned in parallel with military operations rather than in competition with them. This understanding emerged without instruction. No American officer explained it. No guard commented on it. There was no attempt to persuade. The evidence had been provided by movement alone. The journey ended, but the recalibration did not. What the prisoners had seen during those hours on the train would shape their understanding of the war more than any briefing or interrogation. It replaced abstraction with observation, not ideology, not argument, but repetition. The impact of the journey did not produce immediate statements or open discussion. Once settled inside Camp Concordia, daily routine took over. Roll calls, work, details, meals. The structure of captivity replaced the uncertainty of transport. Guards enforced rules consistently. Communication among prisoners was permitted within limits. Life inside the camp stabilized quickly, yet the observations from the train did not fade. They resurfaced in fragments of conversation, usually late in the evening or during work assignments. Prisoners compared notes quietly. What one had seen matched what others had seen. The consistency mattered more than any single detail. No one suggested coincidence. The prisoners began to reframe earlier assumptions. The idea that American strength was temporary became harder to maintain. The farms they had passed were not dependent on emergency mobilization. They were not stripped bare for war. They were productive, orderly, and clearly integrated into a larger system that functioned without visible strain. This reframing was subtle. It did not take the form of ideological rejection. Most prisoners did not suddenly abandon loyalty or belief. Instead, they adjusted expectations. They recalculated timelines. The possibility of a short war receded. From a military perspective, this shift was significant. Soldiers endure hardship more easily when they believe victory is plausible and imminent. When that belief weakens, endurance becomes calculation. The prisoners did not despair, but they began to understand that the conflict might extend beyond what they had been led to expect. The camp administration did not exploit this. American officers did not lecture prisoners about economic strength or production capacity. There were no displays, no guided explanations. Work details involved ordinary tasks: maintenance, agriculture, repair. The environment remained unremarkable. This restraint was deliberate. Psychological pressure did not require amplification. The contrast spoke for itself. As months passed, additional evidence accumulated. Prisoners received Red Cross parcels regularly. Food supplies were consistent. Clothing was replaced when worn. Medical care was available. None of this suggested a nation diverting all resources to the front at the expense of internal stability. News filtered in indirectly. Guards spoke casually of new factories opening, of relatives employed in industries operating at full capacity, of rationing that existed but did not dominate daily life. Prisoners listened more than they responded. The broader picture formed gradually: America's ability to fight a global war without collapsing civilian infrastructure contradicted German wartime assumptions fundamentally. It suggested that the conflict would not be decided by attrition alone. It suggested reserves beyond immediate visibility. The prisoners did not need strategic maps to understand this. They had seen enough from the train windows. The realization did not make captivity easier, but it made outcomes clearer. Hope shifted from military victory to survival and return. Expectations narrowed. The war became something to endure rather than something to win. From an institutional standpoint, this outcome aligned with American policy. The goal was containment, not conversion. Prisoners were not required to admire their captors. They were required only to recognize reality. The train journey had accomplished that. Without intention. When German prisoners were later questioned after the war, many cited the same moment of realization, not during interrogation, not after defeat, but during transport across the American interior. The war had reached a point where propaganda could not compete with observation. The significance lay in what was not done. No speeches. No demonstrations. No argument. Only distance. The miles between the Atlantic coast and central Kansas revealed a depth that maps and intelligence reports had failed to convey. That depth translated into endurance. Endurance translated into outcome. The prisoners adapted to captivity with this understanding in place. The war continued elsewhere. Fronts shifted. Battles were fought. Cities burned. None of that altered what they had already seen. The evidence was not dramatic. The realization formed during that journey did not lead to immediate declarations or recorded statements. It did not need to. For the prisoners at Camp Concordia, the war's outcome began to feel predetermined long before official surrender, not because of ideology, but because of scale. What they had seen could not be reconciled with the idea of a fragile opponent nearing collapse. Over time, that understanding settled into routine acceptance. The camp operated efficiently throughout the remainder of the war. Food supplies remained steady. Medical care was adequate. Work assignments were regular and predictable. There were no signs of systemic strain. Guards rotated normally. Equipment was maintained. Infrastructure functioned without improvisation. None of this was exceptional in isolation. Together, it reinforced what the prisoners had already concluded. When news arrived of Allied landings in France, it was received without surprise. The logistical effort implied by such an operation no longer seemed implausible. When reports followed of sustained offensives across multiple fronts, they aligned with what the prisoners had observed months earlier. The war had not reached its limits. Germany's had. After the surrender in May 1945, repatriation began slowly. Prisoners were processed, transported, and returned to Europe in stages. Many carried with them memories not of defeat in battle, but of quiet observation and transit across an enemy country. In later accounts, some former prisoners described that train ride as the moment certainty replaced belief. Not certainty of defeat in a single sense, but certainty of imbalance. The war was not being fought between equals strained to the limit. It was being fought between systems operating at different depths. This conclusion did not require bitterness. It required acknowledgement. The American interior had revealed something propaganda could not conceal. A society capable of sustaining war without consuming itself. A civilian economy that continued functioning while supplying armies overseas. An agricultural base that fed not only its own population, but allies and prisoners as well. None of this had been staged. The train had followed efficient routes. The scenery had not been curated. What the prisoners saw was what existed. From a historical standpoint, the significance of that journey lies in its quietness. No weapons were fired. No orders were issued. No statements were made. Yet the outcome was decisive in its own way. Wars are not decided solely by battles. They are decided by the capacity to absorb loss, replace material, and sustain effort over time. The German prisoners glimpsed that capacity not through intelligence reports, but through ordinary life continuing uninterrupted. Once seen that, reality could not be reversed. The camp at Concordia remained operational until the final prisoners departed. The farms outside its fences returned to harvest cycles. The rail lines continued carrying goods. The cars remained parked beside houses. The war ended. What remained was a lesson recorded not in doctrine or strategy, but in memory. A recognition that endurance, not collapse, defined the enemy they had been sent to fight. The train had reached its destination months earlier. The understanding it delivered arrived at the war's end.